The Middle Ages were a time of both extraordinary cultural achievement and horrifying brutality. Justice, as it was understood in medieval society, was often cruel and harsh, with torture techniques used as a primary means of both punishment and interrogation. These methods, sanctioned by the Church and the state, were considered necessary tools to extract confessions, punish criminals, and instill fear in the populace. The medieval justice system was rooted in fear, control, and power, where even the slightest accusation could result in agonizing and often fatal consequences. One of the most infamous medieval torture methods was the breaking wheel. This device was a metal frame that forced the victim into a cramped, fetal position. The body was crushed, and the victim's internal organs were often damaged due to the unnatural posture they were forced into. The accused would be tied up and thrown into a body of water. If they floated, they were considered guilty, as it was believed that witches could not drown. If they sank, they were presumed innocent, but at the cost of their life. The king's justice could be swift and brutal, and those who fell out of favor could be subjected to cruel punishments. These techniques were not just confined to executions, but were often part of daily life for those who lived under the oppressive rule of medieval justice. One such method was the wheel of torture, or the breaking wheel, which was used for those who had committed grave offenses or to punish traitors. The condemned were tied to a large wheel and beaten with heavy iron bars, their limbs often crushed before being left to die. While not as visibly brutal as some of the more physical methods, confinement in a medieval prison was often a slow and painful punishment in its own right. The process could take days, with each round of torture pushing the victim closer to death. Often, confessions were obtained under duress, as the victim would do anything to stop the agony, even if it meant falsely implicating themselves in a crime. This device was made of iron and had spikes embedded in the seat and backrest. Many torturers and executioners justified their brutal actions by believing that they were carrying out God's will, ensuring that the guilty paid for their sins. Post-mortem desecration was a common part of medieval justice, where the bodies of executed criminals were sometimes mutilated or displayed as a public warning. Heads were often placed on spikes, and bodies were left in the public square to be gawked at by passers-by. This act of corpse display was meant to not only punish the dead, but to keep the living in line, ensuring that the message of Roman or medieval justice was heard loud and clear. The Church played a central role in this process, as many of the tortures were carried out in the name of maintaining the faith and punishing heretics. The use of torture in the medieval period was often tied to religious beliefs, with those accused of witchcraft or heresy subjected to the most horrific methods of punishment, sometimes even burning at the stake. The victim would be forced to sit in the chair, and the spikes would pierce their flesh, causing immense pain and injury. The purpose was not just physical torture, but to humiliate the victim in front of others. It was a time when fear and intimidation were as important as laws and regulations in maintaining control. The brutal techniques of the past serve as a stark reminder of the importance of fairness, dignity, and respect for all individuals. Today, the tortures of the Middle Ages are studied, not just as historical facts, but as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of ensuring that justice is served humanely with compassion and due process for all. Justice was not about rehabilitation or fairness. It was about power, control, and maintaining the social order. While these techniques may seem incomprehensible to us today, they were once considered essential for the stability of the state. Often, the victim would be publicly paraded in this chair, a symbol of their guilt and punishment. This cruel practice was common in many parts of medieval Europe and was often justified as a way of uncovering the truth. These prisons were dark, damp, and infested with disease. The victim would be placed on a pyramid-shaped seat with the point of the pyramid inserted into the victim's body. They would then be left to slowly impale themselves on the device, which caused immense pain and often led to death. This was a punishment that was often reserved for the most serious crimes, such as heresy or treason, and was designed to break the spirit of the accused as much as their body. Prisoners were often left to languish for years without trial, subjected to harsh conditions and little to no food. The mere threat of being locked away in such a place was enough to make many confess to crimes they may not have committed. Some victims were left on display as a public spectacle to serve as a reminder to others of the consequences of defying the law. One of the most infamous examples was the execution of Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was murdered in his own cathedral after a long period of conflict with King Henry II. The weight of the body would cause the shoulders to dislocate, often resulting in severe internal injuries. This form of torture was used to extract confessions, as the victim would be left hanging for long periods, enduring excruciating pain. It was a common interrogation tool used by the authorities during the medieval period. While Becket's death was not a result of torture, it exemplifies the dangerous power struggle between church and state, which often led to bloody consequences for those involved. This form of trial by ordeal was common in medieval Europe and was used to determine guilt or innocence in a way that defied logic or reason. This form of torture was not just painful but humiliating, as the victim was often displayed publicly while suffering. Victims were tied to a wooden stake, and a fire was set beneath them. This device was used to silence women accused of being witches, often seen as a method of control as much as punishment. The bridle consisted of a metal gag with spikes that would be placed in the victim's mouth, piercing their cheeks and preventing them from speaking. This was not only physically painful, but also stripped the individual of their ability to defend themselves during public trials, which were already rigged against them. The process of burning alive was agonizing, as the person would suffocate from smoke inhalation before being consumed by the flames. This was often done in public, serving both as a form of execution and as a means of terrorizing the population into obedience. Victims, often criminals or those accused of heinous crimes, were tied to a large wheel and then subjected to violent blows to their limbs, often resulting in broken bones. A cloth would be placed over the face and water would be poured into the mouth and nose, making the person feel as if they were drowning. This method of suffocation was designed to cause extreme psychological distress, and it was often used during interrogations to force confessions. The person was then left to die, sometimes for hours, as an example to others. The person would be locked into the pillory and subjected to public humiliation. It was not as physically torturous as some of the other methods, but it was a means of social control, as the person was vulnerable to insults, stones, and other objects thrown by the crowd. The humiliation could last for hours, and the accused often had to endure long periods of physical and emotional distress. The public spectacle of such executions was intended to create fear, ensuring that the populace would remain obedient to the law. Another horrific punishment was the Iron Maiden, a device designed to resemble a human-shaped coffin with spikes on the inside. The victim would be slowly enclosed inside the Iron Maiden, with the spikes piercing the body, causing slow and excruciating pain. This simple yet horrifying contraption was used to stretch the victim's body, often until their joints dislocated or even their limbs were torn from their body. The rack was primarily used to extract confessions during interrogations, with many people subjected to it under the threat of further suffering. The psychological torment, along with the physical pain, often led to false confessions, where the accused admitted to crimes they did not commit just to escape the agony. This was used not only as a form of execution, but also as a form of intimidation to show the extreme consequences of defying authority or breaking the law. Its use was primarily in the 5th–10th century, and although some historians debate its actual historical use, The very idea of such a device sent a chilling message to the people. The rack is perhaps the most well-known of medieval torture devices. The scavenger's daughter was another device used for torture, often used in conjunction with the rack. Medieval torture wasn't limited to physical devices. Waterboarding, or a variation of it, was employed during this period to break the will of the victim. For those accused of witchcraft, a particularly cruel punishment was dunking. In some regions, burning at the stake was the ultimate punishment for those convicted of heresy, witchcraft, or other severe offenses. The pillory was another form of public punishment that involved placing the accused in a wooden frame with holes for the head and hands. Torture in the Middle Ages was not limited to the lower classes. Even royalty and clergy were not exempt from suffering under the hands of the law. As brutal as some of the most infamous medieval torture devices were, there were even more methods that were employed to instill fear, punish crimes, and extract confessions. The strappado was another form of punishment where the victim was tied by their hands, which were bound behind their back, and then hoisted into the air. For those accused of witchcraft, one particularly horrifying technique was the witch's bridle. In addition to physical torture, imprisonment was a key tool of medieval justice. One of the most notorious forms of torture used to break the will of the accused was the question, which referred to a series of increasingly brutal torture methods used to extract a confession. The Judas cradle was another terrifying method of punishment used during the Middle Ages. The iron chair was another method used for those suspected of crimes against the state or the church. One of the most terrifying aspects of medieval punishment was the widespread belief in divine justice. As terrible as the punishment techniques were, they often did not end with the death of the condemned. The widespread use of torture and brutality in medieval justice was a reflection of the period as harsh views on law and order. Medieval justice has left a dark legacy in history, one that still shapes our understanding of human rights and justice today.